Zahira Torres is an investigative reporter covering education for the Los Angeles Times. Prior to joining the Times, Torres was part of the investigative team at the Denver Post and the Austin bureau chief for the El Paso Times in Texas. She's won several state and national awards, including the Freedom of Information Foundation of Texas's top honor for a year-long investigation that exposed a school cheating scheme that denied an untold number of public school students a proper education. Please welcome Zahira Torres.
Hi, everyone. How's everyone doing? Good. I'm excited to be here because I was a high school journalist, which I'll talk more about in the speech, but I'm thrilled to see so many of you here today. I wanted to start by talking a little bit about the two questions I always get as a journalist. The first is always, have you met any famous people? And the second is, what's the story you're most proud of? My answer to the first question is always, yes. That's what happens when you don't ask an open-ended question. My answer to the second question is actually reminds me every day of why I became a journalist. And I wanted to see if we could show a video to kind of show you a little bit about the story we worked on, and then I'll talk more about it.
Over the course of more than 2 years now, we've been able to document a series of failures at the El Paso Independent School District and at the Texas Education Agency. First, there was a complete breakdown of leadership in the district, especially at the school board level, that essentially allowed a rogue superintendent to run unchecked. They gave him a contract that included bonuses based on student performance and then never had any mechanisms to check whether those reports were accurate or honest. It was a real incentive for him to cheat.
The cheating allegations in the El Paso Independent School District really focused on a community that was very vulnerable. I think in many cases you see cheating schemes that revolve around erasing test answers. And in El Paso, it was a very complicated scheme that looked at pushing children out of school, retaining some of them and jumping them to the next grade, all in an effort to, game the system.
The El Paso Independent School District engaged in some rather unique measures that were all really aimed at one purpose. It was to find 10th grade students who might not pass the federal accountability test and somehow get them out of the 10th grade.
The transcripts were, if you will, fixed, or their credits were removed. Student credits were not showing. My immediate supervisors at the time were not happy with the findings that I had. It was something that they were doing to my students that I was responsible for, and I didn't think it was fair.
As the coverage progressed on this project, on this investigative piece, everybody was trying to hide what was happening, or they were not forthcoming, or maybe they didn't understand that what they were doing was illegal and they were hurting kids. We never thought it was right that any kid should be denied an education just because he or she didn't speak English properly or might not have done well on a test.
People were incredibly surprised. The situation was such that even though there had been an investigation at the state level, there seemed to be a clearing of the school district and sort of an acknowledgement that perhaps something was there, but it wasn't big enough to launch a major investigation. And then the paper began its extensive reporting on what was going on. And I think that people's reaction was one of shock, but also of interest. I think this is a story that was important, but it was a story that people didn't have the inside understanding about.
It was very important in the El Paso Times to investigate because things started to come out that I didn't even know were happening.
Bob Moore was incredibly involved throughout the investigation. I mean, from the very beginning, I went to him and said, this is a story that I think we need to tell. And, he was incredibly supportive. I think he, a lot of the time, had to take the heat from community members who didn't want us to work on this story. And he did that really well and supported, the investigation the whole way through.
If you cheat, we'll eventually find out. And if you find out, we're going to take strong action as a consequence of it.
We've seen more people become interested in running for school board positions as a result of this coverage. We've seen more parents getting involved in their schools because they realize that their children's future is truly at stake here.
I think at the beginning the reaction was very, people wondered why we wouldn't let go. And people were somewhat upset. But as the story evolved and as we were able to uncover more documents and talk to more people, I think the community really rallied behind the stories and really started pushing for change, which was a very big move.
Well, what was happening back then is no longer happening now. The district has taken charge. We have lead counselors that are looking into transcripts. We have people working all areas to make sure the accountability is where it needs to be. Our new superintendent, he means business. It's very obvious that he means business.
Now the focus is shifting back to truly educating children rather than gaming the education system. And that's what teachers are in it for, is they want to teach kids. And I think the biggest feedback I've heard from people is that for the first time in maybe a decade, they really do have the opportunity to teach.
The project had a huge impact on El Paso, and it is unique because we are so close to Mexico, we are so close to the border, we are also isolated, we are 500 miles away from almost any other major city, and people think nobody's watching, people think that the state capitol may not be watching, that Washington DC may not be looking at what's going on in El Paso, but now they know that the El Paso Times is looking.
But there's still a lot of work to be done, even though we exposed what may be the most abusive cheating scheme in the history of the country. When it came time to vote for school board members, less than 15% of the eligible voters turned out in El Paso. So we still have a lot of work ahead of us to make sure that the public is engaged with the schools in a meaningful way, to really stand up for their kids, to say, this is the education that we demand for our children. This is the kind of governance we expect as citizens, and to really fight for what everybody else, I think, sometimes takes for granted.
So I want to tell you a little bit about this story and then move on to a few other things. In 2010, I was a reporter for the El Paso Times. That was my hometown newspaper. I just moved to Austin to cover state politics for the newspaper. And an outgoing senator at the time accused the district of gaming the accountability system. He said the district was disappearing children. And it was something that caught our attention, but he didn't have any proof. He was making the allegation, but he didn't really have any proof or anything to substantiate that claim. And so a lot of people dismissed his allegations because he and the superintendent at the time had a history of animosity. As I mentioned, I was in Austin, and I had to cover a state legislative session. It was a session where I had to write daily stories. It was an important session because the state lawmakers were cutting $5 billion out of public education that year. So I continued on with my daily work, and in the meantime, I filed open records requests with the district while the education reporter at the time pursued the story from El Paso. Now, in that time, the State Department of Education cleared the district of wrongdoing. The senator had sent letters to the Federal Education Department and the FBI asking them to investigate. But it wasn't clear where those investigations were headed. The superintendent was already being investigated by the FBI for steering a $450,000 contract to his mistress. When the legislative session ended, I continued to feel like we needed to do more. Accusing a school district of denying children an education is a serious charge, and it was our responsibility to fully seek out whether this was true. We had a new editor at the time. You saw him on the video. His name is Bob Moore. Bob was in El Paso for years before he went to go work for the Fort Collins paper here in Colorado, and he returned to El Paso around the time that I was ending my legislative session. I called Bob even before he started. I'm sure he loved that. And I said, this is still a story I want to pursue. I understand that the state has cleared the district, but I think it's important that we fully vet this out. And he never flinched. And I can't tell you how important that is, that we had an editor who said, you know what, I believe you, do what you need to do, and who said, we'll invest time and resources into getting an answer, whatever that answer may be. So in that time, I spent months talking with current and former employees, many who feared for their jobs. I filed dozens of public records requests, and the district told us that was going to cost us tens of thousands of dollars. Now, I'm sure you all know that newspapers can't afford to pay tens of thousands of dollars. Heck, we could barely afford to pay for pens and notepads sometimes for the newspaper, for the reporters. So what we did is we eventually found this nugget of information in some of the documents we had gotten that said they provided a lot of the same documents to the federal government. Now, a school district and a governmental agency can't charge you for compiling records that they've already compiled for someone else. So we said, we want those documents. And the district fought us. It eventually reached the state's attorney general, and he ruled in our favor and forced the district to release the documents. Those documents offered a look into the district-wide cheating scheme we eventually detailed through interviews with students, with current and former principals, past administrators, the counselor you saw in the video who tried to report the wrongdoing, and an assistant principal who admitted to pushing students out. He said he'd kick students out, awarded credits to, he was part of a scheme that kicked students out, and awarded credits to yet other students who should have failed courses for not showing up. The federal government, as you heard, measures schools or measured schools in Texas by the scores on the 10th grade standardized test and by graduation rates. If a school failed to meet those standards too many times, it faced several sanctions, and that included closure. In one family that we interviewed, 3 brothers were denied an education in the district. They never finished high school and were cleaning offices and working at factories when we met them. There are many other students affected by the cheating scheme. After the stories ran, the district announced an initiative to track down the students and offer them a chance to return to school. The superintendent pleaded guilty to the cheating scheme and to steering a contract to his mistress. He went to federal prison. Several administrators resigned or were fired after the district conducted its own investigation. And members of the elected school board were removed, making the district the largest in state history to face such a severe sanction. El Paso's my hometown. It's a community that has grown accustomed, unfortunately, to public corruption. In recent years, that's included several elected officials taking bribes in exchange for steering contracts to associates. But the stories about the cheating scheme at the city's largest school district resonated with the community because they involved children. Part of the reason our stories had an impact with readers is that they sought to combine documents we obtained with the different perspectives of the people involved or affected. We wrote stories from the viewpoints of students who were told they were being kicked out or not allowed to enroll because they were too far behind to graduate on time, were troublemakers, or were simply seen as a burden. We told stories from the viewpoints of parents who felt overmatched by a district that said they didn't want their children in their schools. An administrator at one school admitted to pushing out brothers Jose, Roger, and Eddie Avalos after they told the newspaper that they were unfairly forced to look at other educational opportunities. Here's a passage from the story we wrote about them. Their mother, Grisel Avalos, still breaks down in tears when she talks about her failed attempts to keep 3 of her oldest sons at Bowie. I thought, this is her speaking now, I thought, what am I doing wrong to defend my children? Grisel Avalos said in Spanish. I fell into a deep depression. I thought, am I crazy to want them to have an education? The coverage also included the accounts of 5 former school principals who said they were forced to retire or resign because they would not follow along with the cheating scheme. One such principal was Stephen Lane. He recounted how on one Friday afternoon, he was abruptly told he was being terminated after the district learned that he was talking to the FBI. He described being escorted out of the school he adored, carrying a box full of personal items and crying as employees watched him leave. Here's an excerpt from that story, in which Lane spoke about the district's former superintendent, Lorenzo Garcia. Lane said Garcia rewarded those who were loyal to him and punished anyone resistant to his scheme. Quote, if you didn't follow the buoy model, you'd find yourself out of a job. He wanted to publicly humiliate people and scare them into doing illegal stuff so he could get a bonus or he could pad his resume. Quote, I know the board said he's a mastermind genius criminal. He's really not. He's a common thief and a bully. That's all he is. When someone finally stood up to him in court, what did he do? He cried like a baby and snitched on his buddies. That's what bullies do from elementary until you're 100. I often tell people that I could have been one of those children pushed out during the cheating scheme. I grew up speaking Spanish. I learned English in school. I'm a product of a single mother who pushed me to do well in school and continue on to college because that was something she never had the opportunity to do. My family never missed the nightly news. I remember my grandmother explaining the importance to me as we were watching it one night. My grandmother had a third-grade education, but she told me that watching the news was important and understanding what was going on in the world was important because it makes you a better member of the community. So from a very early age, I was interested in journalism. When I got to high school, I had a journalism teacher named Patricia Monroe. I won't embarrass her and make her stand up, but she's here today, and I want to thank her. Pat taught us how to write an engaging news story, how to interview sources, and she taught us the importance of ethics. She encouraged us to ask hard questions and to write stories about subjects that didn't just involve our school, but involved the El Paso community. She had such an impact on my life. She made me engage people in a different way, and she made me think of why journalism and pursuing journalism was important. I also want to take a moment to thank all of the journalism advisors here today. Can we give them a round of applause? When districts look to cut budgets, journalism is one of the first classes to feel the hit. And in my opinion, granted it's a very biased opinion, I think that's a travesty. Even if I would not have chosen to work in this field, my high school journalism class taught me to be a better writer. It taught me how to engage people and how to better communicate. Those are tools you'll need in any job. But I do want to take some time to talk to you about the future. I don't know if you've gotten to the point where you're hearing all the horror stories about journalism. Some of those are true. Journalism's not a high-paying job. It's not a field you want to go into if you're trying to make money, and I remember Pat Monroe used to say that to us every day. You work really long hours, and cutbacks have led to fewer reporters doing a lot more work. A day can include taking video, blogging, tweeting, writing several versions of more than one story for online and for print, and doing your own data work. And very importantly, there are fewer editors out there, so it's harder to find a mentor and harder to find people to guide you through. But I think even after saying all of that, journalism is still very much alive, and meaningful journalism is still achievable. Almost every journalist you talk to, at least every journalist I've talked to, has told me they wouldn't want to be doing anything else. They want to be a journalist. I'll go further and I'll say, I don't want to live in a world without journalism. It's inspiring to see so many students here today, and to know that some of you here will be the ones that hold government, companies, and people accountable, and to the ones who will tell stories that are important. I remain optimistic about the work that news organizations are producing, and I'm especially excited by the prospects of data to help tell a story. I'm a big believer in document-driven journalism. That doesn't mean that there shouldn't be a focus on developing sources and on using people's voices to tell a story. But documents help tell that story in a very strong way. Let's talk a little bit more about that, what I mean about helping to tell a story. We live in a world in which digital records are collected for nearly everything, whether it's conditions in nursing homes or whether it's about police-involved shootings. Consider the Florida Sun-Sentinel's Pulitzer Prize-winning coverage of speeding by off-duty police officers in 2012. By collecting information from toll roads, they were able to show that nearly 800 police officers from a dozen police agencies drove from 90 to 130 miles an hour. In many cases, these officers were speeding while off-duty or on their way to and from work. The Los Angeles Times, with documents obtained through an open records request, revealed that leaders in Bell, one of California's poorest towns, were cutting services by laying off staff and paying themselves inflated salaries. Bell's a town of 39,000 people. That's smaller than most districts. Well, I won't say most districts are small, but that's smaller than the districts where I grew up. But they were paying their city manager $800,000 a year. Their assistant city manager was making $376,000 a year, and the police chief was being paid $457,000. Part-time city council members were making $100,000 annually. The series led to resignations, arrests, and a refund of $2.9 million to taxpayers. When I was a reporter at the Denver Post, we partnered with Channel 7 to look at school violence data after the shooting at Arapahoe High School. We found that while state law requires districts to report discipline and safety information at schools, the school safety information offered to parents lacks state oversight and varies wildly from one district to the next. That meant that some schools failed to report assaults that police would consider felonies, while others documented even the smallest scuffle between elementary schools. Think about that for a second. That means that a school that is trying to follow the rules and report every incident that happens, but is safe, would appear to be much more dangerous, maybe, than schools that are having serious issues with assaults and, in some cases, in our findings, sexual assaults. So we also found in that story that state law mandated that law enforcement agencies submit annual reports on violence at schools. But few agencies had done so. And there was no repercussion for not submitting it, so many didn't. Those reports were meant to gauge school violence and whether minority students were being disproportionately punished for minor infractions. After the stories, lawmakers filed legislation to strengthen that law. I'll give you one other example. After starting at the Los Angeles Times in February, I found data on the state's website showing that school districts statewide had $20 billion in retiree health obligations for which they had not saved money. Instead of raising educators' salaries for years, the school districts in California offered educators, and I should say this is some school districts, offered educators health benefits for life, but they didn't save for those health benefits. In fact, the Los Angeles Unified School District, the second largest school district in the country, would have to pay $868 million annually for 30 years to fully fund retiree healthcare obligation, according to estimates. This is what I mean by data and document-driven stories can be very powerful. It has a way of improving our ability to tell stories that we're not able to tackle otherwise. And the exciting part is that news organizations recognize this. Understanding how to obtain data and analyze that data and documents not only makes you a better journalist, but it's something that newspaper organizations look for, and news organizations look for when they're hiring candidates. So, one piece of advice, and probably one of my bigger pieces of advice, would be learn your state's open records laws. Understand how to access data, and take classes that will help you master how to use that data in your reporting. I also want to offer a few additional tips that I've learned from a few smart people along the way. I just told you about the benefits of data analysis. And I think, indeed, journalism is going to be shaped by new technology and new ways to tell stories. But never discount the power of strong writing. Becoming a good writer will serve you in everything you do. Find someone. I'll say that a few people told me this, and it's actually been one of the best pieces of advice for me anyway. They said, find someone to write for. I think stories can get complicated, and we as journalists are guilty of sometimes not making them as clear as they should be. So I write for my little brother. He's smart, and he cares about things. He cares about his community, but he doesn't follow the news as closely as the people in this room do. So I strive to write compelling articles that will capture his interest. Another piece of advice is, and something I didn't do enough of when I was in high school, and quite frankly when I entered college, is take advantage of every internship opportunity that you can. And find other ways to learn. So when I graduated high school and went into college, I took a part-time job writing obituaries at the El Paso Times. And that's how I worked my way up. Work at your student newspaper. Ask if you can shadow a professional journalist for a day. You may be surprised, but a lot of journalists enjoy sharing, kind of what they've learned with other journalists. We want to see the industry get better and stronger, and we know that you all are the future. Make sure you're familiar with the journalism organizations, such as Investigative Reporters and Editors, which is also known as IRE. There are many professional organizations out there that also have a component geared towards student journalists. I'm a member of IRE, and I'm a member of the National Association of Hispanic Journalists. And both of those organizations have programs and scholarships for student journalists. Newspapers looking to hire interns take time to study candidates, and this means they look at social media accounts. So you should already be thinking about how you present yourself to the world. Also, journalism degrees are important, they're relevant, but you don't have to have a journalism degree to become a journalist. Many working journalists either double majored or studied a different concentration, such as political science. I'm a political science major. But you do have to have experience in journalism. And that means you can gain that experience at your college newspaper, or you can gain it somewhere else. But you do have to take some time to learn what it means to be a journalist. I struggle with this one because I was in high school journalism, as I mentioned, and that taught me a lot of things. I do worry that not having some journalism experience doesn't teach you certain things. For example, I learned all about ethics in high school. So when I went to, the newspaper, my local newspaper, and I wrote a story, I didn't need to have someone tell me you can't eat the food at that they offer you, or you need to make sure that you treat people with respect and compassion. I knew that already. So I think you all who have been in high school journalism and learned that could easily look into other fields and still be a journalist if you want to be. But I do worry about it with people who haven't been taught those things. And, you know, this seems like a no-brainer, but I was just talking to our editor who selects our interns, and she said to me that people should be careful when they apply for internships to address the letter to the correct organization. So she said that she's already thrown away a few applications this year from candidates who told her how much they wanted to work for NBC, BuzzFeed, or fill in the blank with another entity that's not named the Los Angeles Times. And finally, I want to say, never forget why you're a journalist. You're trying to tell stories that offer a better understanding of our governments, our communities, and who we are as people. And that's powerful and it's important. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll be making my way around the audience. If you have a question for Zahira Torres, please just raise your hand and I'll get to as many of you as possible in the time that we have left. Zahira, I actually wanted to start, a lot of what you talked about is mirroring a lot of what we're hearing out of Atlanta right now in terms of state testing, and state testing obviously resonates with this crowd. What can student publications be doing to investigate the issue more thoroughly?
I think that's a great question. I mean, I think that a lot of these things could come out of student publications. I was just kind of lamenting that sometimes in journalism, you know, we aren't as close and attached to the communities as we should be. And so as student journalists, you know these things, you hear these things. I would say what I would do, I'll give you an example of Texas, but it kind of goes with every other state because every state keeps some form of this information. So Texas keeps pretty good records on student testing, and it tells you how students scored, not individual students, but it gives you aggregates. And what was important in our story was we had to understand how the systems worked, right? So federal accountability works not only on the large scale of looking at graduation rates and student test scores, but it looks at subgroups, minority subgroups. And that's what was important in our story. Because in Texas, if you had more than 49 students, your subgroup counted against you. So a lot of some of the schools that looked to move students out who were not performing well made sure that they moved enough students out of the, you know, that kind of key group so that their test scores wouldn't count at all. I mean, it didn't matter if they failed, they wouldn't count because they had fewer students than was the number that needed to be counted. So I would start there. I mean, I would start with really understanding the way that federal and state accountability works in your state, because both of those matter, and school districts get judged by both. I would also, I mean, one important thing that I didn't talk about that you need to understand is the pressures of high-stakes testing. So you need to understand how high-stakes testing impacts or affects the decisions that educators are making. That's not to say that it's okay to game the system, but they are under pressure to have a certain amount of students pass. So you need to understand that when you're telling the story. Atlanta did great work. And you know, this is where you know that awards don't really matter because they had such an impact, but they didn't win a Pulitzer for that work. So what Atlanta did is they looked at a different kind of scheme, which also involves understanding your systems. They looked at schools that erased test scores and went from there. But, you know, I think the key things you need to know is know your state and federal accountability rules, know the laws in your state for open records because you will have to file open records at some point. And, you know, don't be afraid to ask things you don't know. You know, it's easy to, you're in school And why wouldn't you want to know how the accountability system works and how it affects students in your school? But I hope that all of you really do pursue that, because I think that cheating schemes change over time. And we saw that in El Paso. We saw that there was a superintendent who was no longer saying, let's erase test scores. He was saying, let's find a way to not have to deal with the test score situation, and let's move the numbers. Let's figure out how to make sure these students don't count or don't hurt us. So, just kind of learn as much as you possibly can.
We had a question from the audience that was asking about, when it comes to data journalism, you're using a lot of statistics, and statistics have the problem of maybe being either misinterpreted or used for different purposes. How do you ensure as a journalist that the data journalism that you're doing and the data that you're collecting is seeking the truth and not just a slant of the truth?
That's probably one of the most important questions of data journalism. I think that the way you do that is you have to really understand what you're working with. So you get the data and you start there, but you can't come to a conclusion without having talked to people, without having researched topics, without even going to the people that you believe might be doing something wrong and saying, explain this to me, explain to me what I'm seeing in this data. It also requires some recognition of when people are telling you the truth and when they're not, which means you have to talk to a lot of people. We don't put out any, especially at the Los Angeles Times, we don't put out any data that we haven't fully vetted. It's something that our data editor is very strong about, and we want to make sure that when that goes out, nobody's going to come back and say, oh, you understood this and you didn't understand this the right way. So you do have to use it as kind of a building block. You can't say, I've got the data, here's my story, this is what the data tells me.
Okay, this question comes from Twitter. Tulia Kaponen asked, everyone has something that drives them to do what they do in spite of any difficulties. So what is it that drives you in spite of them?
I think for me, I grew up poor, and I grew up in a family that a lot of times didn't know how to speak up for itself. And a lot of times trusted the systems to do what was right. And I think there are a lot of people out there who believe that, or who trust the system to do the right things for them. You know, you're a taxpayer, you send your kids to school and you think they're gonna be okay, the principals are gonna do the right thing by them, the superintendent's gonna do the right thing by them, and you don't question things. And I think that growing up that way, it was always strange when I did question things to my family. My family always thought, well, why are you questioning that? I mean, it's the way things are done. So I've always been kind of driven by this idea that, one, it's our right to know these things. But two, there are so many people out there who don't have a voice and who can't speak for themselves, that it's really our job to make sure that they are reflected in our stories, that taxpayers and that students and educators have someone who's out there asking questions for them, because they're just trying to do their jobs every day. They're just trying to work and do what's right for their families. And it's our job to make sure that we're doing right by them.
Hi, I'm Maggie from Timberline High School, and
Hi.
I had a question about the El Paso teachers, because
Yes.
so often we hear about the school districts and the administrators and sort of the people up top, but the people who actually work with the students, we don't hear about them so often. My mom's a teacher, so I sort of have a bit of a bias here, but I was wondering when you talked to them, what their reactions were to this cheating scandal and really what they wanted to do for their students, because obviously they're the ones who are working with the students and they want their students to succeed.
I think it's partly what Bob said in the video, which is we found that a lot of teachers would call us and express a feeling of relief. I don't think a lot of teachers knew what was going on. I mean, you're going about and you're doing your job, and you don't know that there are people up here who are messing with numbers, right? But But a lot of the teachers we talked to were thankful and expressed relief that they could get back to their classrooms and focus on their classrooms because they were feeling so much pressure from, an administration that was trying to, game the system. And I don't know that they necessarily knew kind of the extent of the way that administrators were trying to do that, but they definitely felt the pressure of it. So I think that teachers play a key role in this, and they were really, in some ways, our biggest supporters.
Here's another question from Twitter. Alex Nicole says, how did you locate your sources, especially those still working for the district and who could have been reprimanded or fired?
So that was really hard. I mean, when this story first came up, when the senator first made his allegations, the first thing that I asked him was, well, who's telling you this? Where are your sources? Who are you actually hearing this information from? And he never really could provide who those people were. So I kind of had to start from scratch. And what I did was I started reaching out to, I'd been the education reporter before I was the state politics reporter. And so I started reaching out to people that I knew, people that, I think that's the important part of covering a beat. You learn to know people through covering other things. And so I started reaching out to those people, and some of them knew things, and some of them had suggestions for other administrators who might, or other teachers, or other, principals or former principals who might be willing to talk. The difficult part at the beginning was nobody wanted to talk on the record, and that's always difficult for a journalist. Nobody wanted to put their name out there and risk the fact that we might not follow through with the story. So, I talked to a lot of people. After finding them, I talked to a lot of people, but then I had to prove to them that we were serious about this story. And that meant going out and filing those open records requests and getting that information back and meeting more people and having the knowledge, showing them every time we spoke that I knew more about the subject, that I could, even if it didn't mean that I'd made progress in uncovering some cheating scheme, that I understood what the accountability system was and how things worked. So that was the key way that I identified sources. Now, after the documents came out, there was a whole new group of sources, right? Pat Scott, who's the counselor that you saw, she was never someone that we had heard of before. And when we got those documents, we found that she had tried to tell her superiors that students were being kicked out of school or grades were being changed. And we reached out to her, and she'll tell you now when you talk to her that I showed up at her house, gosh, I don't know. I mean, I don't think I showed up every day or anything, but I showed up at her house maybe once a week. And at the beginning, she said, I don't want to talk to you. I don't want to say anything to you. I've said as much as I need to say. I reported these things. And so, I would speak with her very respectfully, and I'd come back the next week. And I'd just keep trying and talking to her until she finally said, okay, let's sit down. I'll talk to you about what happened. So I think it's just a mix of things.
So I'm Mackenzie from Coronado High School in Colorado Springs, and I was wondering, as a journalist, how hard is it for you to not say anything about your articles or about the statistics or anything before the article comes out, especially when it comes to like a special interest piece?
You mean not say anything to the public, not say anything to, okay.
Like anything at all until the article actually comes out.
I mean, I guess that's a little bit of a tough question because you don't want to get beat on a story. I mean, no journalist wants to get beat on a story, but I try to make it very clear to the people that we're covering what we're doing. I'm not a believer in surprises, right? I think that you need to be tough on people, but you need to be fair. And so at least the people that we're covering, the subject that we're covering, I make sure that they understand this is what we're writing about. I mean, they're not going to know who's commenting and who's saying what and, all the specifics of it, but they know what the story's about. In terms of getting it out, kind of keeping it from the public until we're ready to publish, I think that's harder nowadays. I think that in this age of social media, it's really hard to keep anything out. And so I think that what we do is we try to be thorough, and we just kind of hope that people that we've interviewed aren't going to release the information, but we also put the information out as soon as we get it. A lot of times we don't wait till the publication date in print, we'll put it online early so that people know what's coming.
Do you think that might hurt long-form or investigative journalism if the idea of keeping a story under wraps for a month or 2 months just isn't as possible anymore, if your sources can just go to social media and say, Zahira Torres is working on this story?
I used to think that. I don't think that anymore. I mean, I think I'm a big believer, actually, on not waiting, a year, 8 months to produce one big package. I'm a big believer in producing stories as they come along. Now, sometimes those stories do take 2 months to come along, but I don't think it hurts long-form journalism. I think long-form journalism, I think, is what people are still reading. And so I think that at least, even if someone picks off a piece to write a story from another newspaper, I've worked on this for 2 months. My story may not be the first story, but it's going to be the biggest, it's going to have the biggest impact and have the most information. So I don't think that it hurts to, one, I don't think it hurts to get beat all the time. And two, I don't think that it hurts long-form journalism, because I think that the people that are reading online are not always the same people that are reading the paper. And so I think in some ways you are appealing to different audiences, and you're reaching people that you wouldn't have reached through the traditional newspaper.
We're going to do one last question from Twitter. This comes from Austin Leish, asks, what impact has journalism had on your life?
Gosh, that's a big question. It's had a huge impact on my life. I mean, it's been my life since I was 14. I never stopped being in journalism. I mean, I was in high school journalism. In college, I worked at the college newspaper, and I've done it all these years, even through tough times. I think it's helped me as a person. It's helped me look at things in a better way. I mean, at least in a more open way. And it's helped me become a better analyst of things. I will tell you, I've heard journalists say this, and I'm lucky because I have a husband who is incredibly supportive, but I've heard a lot of journalists say that it affects your personal life. You spend so much time working on a story, making sure it's right, making sure that you get so excited when you're pulling out a piece and you're trying to work harder that sometimes you kind of neglect some of the more important things in your life. And, I've done that. And I have family that's very supportive and very accepting. But it does make you think that you have to find a better balance in your life. And so you want to be that great journalist, but you also want to make time for, the things that are going to be there when journalism isn't there anymore in your life.
Well, great. Thank you very much. Can we get one more round of applause for Zahira Torres?